So may I just make one small correction? I'm very grateful to Ms. Milligan for bringing this to my attention. I referred to a reference, which is FACT 505, to the 1943 Ministry of Health memorandum. She's expressed to me, and she is right, that the reference should in fact be NHBT 5091_011. Instead, sir, instead of patient choice, the shadow of experimentation looms large over this inquiry. The evidence from victims tells us consent was not freely given, but the disturbing evidence which concerns experimentation and clinical studies is obvious and before us. The only good letter we examined earlier bears on this issue for obvious reason. We've had examples of this. I'm going to be referring at the moment to the Royal Free. The Royal Free's late adoption of concentrates gave rise, we suggest, to a greater responsibility on behalf of Doctors Kernoff and Tuddenham to weigh the benefit versus risk of concentrates in each individual patient. It was well known by 1978 that NAMB was a particular risk in concentrates that was not believed at that time, that was what was thought, to be so prolific a risk in cryoprecipitate. We suggest that there is a connection between Doctors Kernoff and Tuddenham switching patients to concentrates and at the same time implementing a policy of retaining blood samples from patients in order to study hepatitis. The late adoption of concentrates at the Royal Free put the physicians there in a particularly advantageous position when in 1982 the risk of AIDS became apparent, because there had only been a relatively short interval since the use of cryoprecipitate had stopped. We suggest that there was another choice available but not taken, that Doctors Kernoff and Tuddenham failed to take advantage of at the Royal Free, which was to acknowledge the experience of general cryoprecipitate treatment and revert to it, reducing the possible incidence of further infection with AIDS. Professor Lee gave evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal concerning the organisation at the Royal Free prior to 78. Reference is LIND 40326_0005. Well, at the Royal Free, they went on using it probably for longer than other places. And this was because Catherine Dormady had this pioneering experience, I suppose, and was very enthusiastic about cryoprecipitate. She, Professor Lee went on to say, said, I'm afraid our centre is full of disasters. She, in 1978, referring to Dr. Dormady, died just at the point the new centre had been built. And two co-directors were put in, Dr. Kernoff and Dr. Tuddenham. And they were young doctors, and they came in 78 and very rapidly changed everybody to concentrate. There had been some people who had had concentrate before then, but I think up until 78, the majority was still probably on cryoprecipitate. Dr. Tuddenham tells us that when he came to the Royal Free as the Haemophilia Centre Director in 1978, Catherine Dormady, Dr. Dormady, was terminally ill. And the service was then being run by Dr. Eleanor Goldman with the assistance of a senior nurse. Dr. Tuddenham goes on to tell us about how arrangements changed once he and Professor Kernoff took their directorships. That's in reference WITN 3435002_0009. He says, to begin with, obtaining supplies of treatment materials, cryoprecipitate, plasma, NHS concentrates of factor 6 or factor 8. Sorry, I'll change that in a moment. And commercial factor concentrates was handled by Dr. Goldman. As soon as Dr. Kernoff arrived as my co-director in mid-78, he took over that. Dr. Kernoff, with his research interest in blood-transmitted hepatitis, instituted a plasma serum bank of stored plasma samples taken regularly from patients attending for treatment. Why was the royal free attractive to Professor Kurnoff? Logically, given his interest in post-transfusion hepatitis, would it have not made more sense for him to look for a position in a centre with a higher incidence of post-transfusion hepatitis? It is possible that Professor Kurnoff's attraction to the Royal Free was the comparative number of patients who had not, by 78, been exposed to large ball concentrates. We suggest that the work of Professors Kurnoff and Lee in their 85 paper, titled High Risk of Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis After a First Exposure to Volunteer or Commercial Clotting Factor Concentrates, would concentrate clinical research. In that Professor Kurnoff altered the treatment of haemophilia patients with the intention of following them up and establishing the rate at which they became infected with post-transfusion hepatitis. Now, in the early days of the use of blood concentrates as treatment, and essentially during the time whereby there's evidence before this inquiry of experimentation, it wasn't in fact that long ago. In 1947, we had the drafting of the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code emphasizes that voluntary consent of the human subject is essential when experimenting on them. And I quote, "This means that the person involved should have the legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or any other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision." In a moment, I will turn to licensing and discuss its role and the facts that you have to consider. But before I do, let me summarize what we say about consent, the timely provision of information, experimentation, and harm, and the consequences that may follow. The criminal law is, in effect, the bottom line of regulation. Criminal law says that if people harm each other, then there will be consequences. Doctors have no special immunity. A doctor treating a patient and touching them for the purposes of a diagnosis and possible treatment does so with the consent of the patient who has come to the doctor for their medical expertise. Well, so far, so good. Haemophiliacs suffer from an inherited disorder, which means that they require expert medical support throughout their lives. If a doctor invasively treats a patient without their consent and harm is caused, then they open themselves up to a prosecution. Now, of course, the CPS in this country or relevant prosecution authorities in Northern Ireland and Scotland will have to consider whether it is in the public interest to prosecute any case, and some cases are clearer perhaps than others. I was discussing this the other day with Clive Smith, the chair of the Haemophilia Society. He is an experienced criminal advocate as well. And his point, a good one, is that there may be real clarity in cases where patients were not told of their infected status and passed on their infection to their partners. That might mark a high point in criminality. But all treatment without consent causing harm needs to be considered through that, as I call it, the bottom line of regulation, the criminal law. Now, it is now 2023, and in some cases it has been many decades, perhaps even 50 years, since the individual was infected. Time itself is no barrier to prosecution of cases. You'll have seen our discussion within our written submission, sir, of the difficulties of the operation of the old year-and-a-day rule that poses particular problems for allegations of a homicide. Obtaining the interest and engagement of local police authorities is not going to be easy. It is always going to be difficult. They will regard these cases as complex cases. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't consider them, but we have to accept that there will be real difficulties in looking at that in the future. One of the factors that, sir, this inquiry needs to consider the compensation framework needs to consider in the future is the lost opportunity for accountability through criminal law and criminal prosecution of individual doctors because of the passage of time and the prevarication by the state and the failure to own up or fess up to their own culpability. Let me deal now and turn to licensing. In the creation of this scandal, the perils of a system where doctors decided to make their patients' choices for them went hand in hand with a failure to properly regulate the use of concentrates. You, sir, have heard and seen a great deal of evidence on the machinations of the licensing regime. This effectively operated as a chain. The Department of Health Medicines Division evaluated the licensing application and sent it to the most relevant specialist subcommittee of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, the CSM, which in the case of blood products went to the Biological Subcommittee. The Biological Subcommittee fed its recommendations to the CSM, which in turn advised the Minister of the Department of Health, who is the licensing authority. Against a backdrop of the decades of awareness of the risk posed by blood products that we have outlined, and particularly the risks from larger pools, one of the central questions for this inquiry to answer is how is it that this country's regulator came to license the use of large pool commercial concentrates in the early 70s? That was a decision which undeniably and irrevocably changed the landscape of risk. The answer perhaps boils down to this. As with those administering blood products, the regulators failed in their duty to assess the risk by reference not only to the harm it might cause, but also to the relative benefit to be gained. Now that was supposed to be the essence of the task entrusted to them by Section 19 of the Medicines Act 1968. They were asked to have particular regard to safety, efficacy, and quality. The first product licenses issued in respect of concentrates were those for haemophil and cryobilin in February and March of 73. As we've already discussed, at that time it had been known for decades that blood products carried a risk of virus transmission, and more importantly, that the risk increased as pool sizes themselves increased. We know that, as an example, memo produced in 1946 the Ministry of Health, DHSC 01508_191. The Ministry's consultant advisor on blood transfusion wrote at that time, while homologous serum jaundice follows the use of whole blood in very few of the recipients, the use of dried plasma is followed by the development of jaundice in about 10% of those receiving it. This incidence is probably halved if plasma is used which is made from plasma pools derived from the blood of only 10 donors instead of from large pools derived from the blood of greater numbers. Can I emphasize plasma pools being referred to of 10 donors? Anything in that Ministry of Health document above 10 was a large pool. That was 1946. Come 73, the time of the license approvals, it was also known that imported blood products, particularly those obtained from the US, carried a higher degree of infection. In fact, that very same month, an expert group was convened by the Department of Health to create self-sufficiency targets. The inquiry's chronology quotes the Archer report at page 28, which states, in 73, the Department of Health convened a group of experts to assess the likely future requirements of factor VIII concentrate. It met on 20th of March 1973 and quickly agreed that the UK should become self-sufficient in the shortest possible time. It estimated that to achieve self-sufficiency would require 400,000 donations of blood annually, of which 275,000 should be used for factor VIII concentrates. That effort was driven, at least in part, by the department's knowledge that foreign blood products carried a greater risk of infection. That much was admitted In the 2007 self-sufficiency report, since withdrawn as a result of the compelling critique in the dissertation of our client, Carol Grayson. There can be no room for doubt that the specialists who constituted the biological subcommittee of the CSM, as well as the CSM itself, were alive to these issues. For example, in its consideration of the product license application for Hemofil, DHSC 0105593 underscore 006, paragraph 26, the CSM noted, the major disadvantage of currently available commercial preparations, such as Hemofil, is that they are prepared from very large plasma pools and carry the risk of transmitting hepatitis virus. Highland screen all their donors hepatitis-associated antigen, which reduces but does not eliminate this risk. We know that Hemofil at that time was prepared from pools of at least 1,000 donors. Cryobulin was manufactured from a plasma pool of at least 1,000 donors. See, in these terms, relative reference, SHPL 000050, in fact, 71_135. And a report from Dr. Maycock in January of 1973 noted that pool sizes for cryobulin were smaller than those for Hemofil. That reference is MHRA 00333322_057. So we ask this question. How on earth could the CSM approve a jump from 10 donors to 1,000 donors? The Ministry of Health document from 63, 10 years prior, states that all dried plasma or serum issued in the United Kingdom is prepared from pools made from not more than 10 donors. That's a JPA C 40162. We submit that the leap in pool sizes was nothing short of recklessness. And we know, sir, that this got worse, pooling and repooling. There was a well-traversed path of apprehension towards larger pools of plasma, and for good reason. On the other hand, there was a complete absence of evidence to justify increasing pool size or testing under controlled conditions, compliant with Nuremberg, and those potential way forward with, in relation to possible ways of trying to establish safety, thrown to the wind. That reckless decision would prove to be a gateway to the infected blood scandal. Thereafter, pool sizes continued to skyrocket, climbing even to 50,000 donors, and then 300,000 donors with the advent of repooling. Infections, of course, skyrocketed. These are not, and were not, complicated questions of medicine, which are now being interpreted with the benefit of hindsight. This is a question of basic maths. If exposure to one donor's blood poses a percentage of risk, what happens when concentrate is made from the blood of two donors? The risk doubles. Children can do that sum. It should also be remembered that the initial decision to license was not a binary one. The licensing authority's choice was not merely between yes to allowing concentrates or no to banning concentrates. It had the power to work slowly and incrementally, and to impose safety conditions or qualifications as a precaution. Those conditions could have included, for example, restricting pool sizes, only permitting blood from certain sources, testing and batch release certificates, which could be combined with a cautious product rollout, product warnings and guidance. All of those measures could have controlled or mitigated the risk. Instead, what happened? Everything was allowed in. Caution thrown to the wind. Our submission on this decision-making is simple. That expansion in donor exposure without control measures cannot be justified now and could not be justified then. There was a failure by the licensing authority, the CSM and its biologicals subcommittee to treat patient safety with primacy. The CSM said in its consideration of the Hemofil application, DHSC 01-05593_6, it may be considered that the decision to use this material could be left to the individual clinician who can balance the potential hazard against the anticipated therapeutic benefit to the patient. Similar risk-benefit considerations were reported in the CSM's reflections, informally relayed this is from Norman Berry to Dr. Ebel, and referred to in SHP L 40665_142 at item 2.7. And these were shared in relation to Immuno's 1973 application. The committee see the justification of some risk of hepatitis in treating a haemophiliac who would otherwise die from hemorrhage. Yet notwithstanding the CSM's view, or understanding that the risk should only be entertained for those whom there might be grave consequences, that qualification or caution did not appear anywhere, whether in licensing decisions or in requirements for product literature. It should have done. And as we know, clinicians did not take that approach. They ought to have done. Now, although licenses did not always run back to back or for their entire period of 5 years, we suggest that it is instructive to look at what was going on and what was known every 5 years after those initial licenses. We fast forward to 78, and using the Lancet alone as a source, though there are many others, in a study by Professor Alter with inoculated chimpanzees, it was concluded that NA-NB hepatitis seems to be due to a transmissible agent which can persist and remain infectious for long periods, PRSE 0004515. And of course, the study by Professor Preston and his contemporaries concluded that NA-NB hepatitis was more serious and progressive than was generally thought to be the case, PRSE 0003622. We also know that around that time, the yellow card system reporting to the CSM incidents of NA-NB hepatitis following treatment from various factor VIII products, and discussed in the recently served witness statement of Anne Ryan, exhibits a table and 7 such reports from 79. And the table, by way of reference, is WITN 7183007. Another reference to it is at WITN 7183006. It's unclear as to why they chose 1979 and what the records from earlier years show. But those references should have resulted in action. If one considers the 1989 affidavit of the CSM's chairman in a judicial review relating to antidepressant licenses, WITN 6406024, Professor Ashler says this is at page 9, paragraph 15.2, that the yellow card scheme distinguished between serious and minor reactions. Serious reactions were to be defined as those which were fatal, life-threatening, disabling, incapacitating, which result in or prolong hospitalization. Professor Asher said that blood disorders would always be considered serious. Yet the CSM and the licensing authority, the ministry, were still approving licenses with ever-increasing pool sizes without adequate control mechanisms. 5 years later, in 1983, knowledge of the dangers of HIV and AIDS had become part of everyone's lives. What is more, at that stage, the CDC had published its report which linked the transmission of HIV to blood products. The CDC notified directors of haemophilia centres and advised that patients and parents should be aware of the potential risks. Reference to that is BAY P 5018_119. Why didn't that happen here? Why did the CSM and licensing authority not take similar measures? Why instead were licenses continually approved with increasing pool sizes and without adequate control mechanisms? The CSM's push for the licensing authority to move towards heat-treated factor VIII came late, very late in 84 and into 85. I refer now to the minutes of the meeting of the 22nd November 1984, DHSC 0003947 _ 015. Dr. Joseph Smith informed the committee that heat treatment of factor VIII, which is used in the treatment of haemophiliacs, abolished detectable infectivity of AIDS virus added to the preparation. Therefore, companies should be encouraged to apply for variation of licenses to permit widespread use of heat-treated factor VIII so that the incidence of AIDS in haemophiliacs might be reduced. The committee, this is the final paragraph, the committee requested that the licensing authority propose to the companies concerned that they make early applications for variations to use a dry heating process in the manufacture of their factor VIII products. Even at that stage, even at that late stage, the authorities' approach was not to mandate heat treatment, backed by a threat of pulling licenses, or indeed to pull licenses, but instead made proposals to the manufacturers that they make early applications for variations. We suggest that a closer look reveals that the licensing authorities' approach to those variation applications were slipshod. And we say that they were focused on external appearances rather than being genuinely motivated by patient safety. Consider, for example, in this regard, the internal immunocommunications, SHPL 5048 _ 026, in which it was reported. Subject to minor alterations in title and directions circular, we have been awarded a product license modification. We have, however, been informed, both unofficially and officially, that the information submitted by us for this modification was most inadequate, and but for the panic situation which existed to get everyone on heat-treated material as quickly as possible, we would have been turned down. They expected far better proof of inactivation, with evidence obtained against 6, 7, or 8 different viruses. They wanted greater evidence shown by clinical evaluation that the product remained equally effective and with no increase in side effects. Make no mistake, sir, make no mistake. A regulator truly motivated by patient safety would have pulled the non-inactivated products and only allowed those with adequate evidence of viral inactivation. We repeat, the actions of the CSM and the licensing authority were reckless. Although we have presented our analysis by reference to those 5-year intervals, it must be remembered that those intervals, representing theoretical product license renewal applications, were not the only or isolated windows of opportunity. The licensing authority had the power to revoke, suspend, or vary licenses at any time if the concentrates could no longer be regarded as safe or efficacious. Despite all of the information that was known to those authorities, as this inquiry has shown, those powers were never exercised. They should have been. Again, the only reasonable conclusion to be drawn from that action or inaction is that patient safety came second and firmly behind commercial continuity. Finally, we highlight that the efficacy of any regulatory regime also has to be judged by its workarounds or loopholes. The Medicines Act 1968 created significant loopholes in the licensing regime, which may have contributed to the erroneous decisions being made and to the extent of infections which were spread. Can we highlight 2 important points? First, one of the most significant loopholes was the named patient basis exception. Now, that allowed medical professionals to go about purchasing and importing blood products which had not been granted a product license at their whim, or perhaps because of the effective advertising by pharmaceutical companies. There was no adequate regulatory oversight of the use of products on that basis until May '84. So as you're aware, we say much more on that loophole in our written submissions. But for the purposes of today's submission, we say that that was the doctor knows best dogma, robbing a regulatory regime of any teeth and cutting it off at the knees. Second, there is evidence that licensing decisions bypass the CSM and the CSM Biological Subcommittee, and therefore evaded the scrutiny of those who might reasonably have been expected to be in the know on the risks posed by the products, and indeed of the developing science. As we explain in our written submissions, the statutory regime only required the CSM's input were a license to be refused. So the system was this. The statutory system was for an application to be made for licensing, and that would go to the medicines division. And then if it were or might be rejected or refused, it would then go to the CSM. Although some of the evidence presented in this inquiry has suggested that in fact the CSM's views were routinely sought, the evidence disclosed just 2, perhaps 3 days ago now, shows that this was not always the case, and this was the second loophole. The second witness statement of Dr. Diana Wolford, the senior medical officer at the Department of Health, witness statement I refer to as this, WITN 446-1158, disclosed on Wednesday, explained that in 1977 the CSM and the CSM Biological Subcommittee were not consulted on Immuno's variation application in respect of cryobuline. Now that had included the fact that it sought to move from German and Austrian sources of plasma to those from the US. What's more, it is also apparent from that statement that Immuno were able to conceal knowledge of the American plasma's higher risk of hepatitis from the licensing authority. Undoubtedly, the loophole that was the lack of routine CSM input contributed to that situation. But, and this was something that the inquiry's Rule 9 request also picked up on, the licensing regime also failed to impose any legal obligation on a manufacturer to disclose that information by way of reference in relation to applications. Those are, we say, issues that arose because of the opt-in and toothless nature of that regulatory regime. New chapter heading. What should have happened? There was a history of research, sir, dating back to Pasteur, which showed the efficacy of heat treatment, and particularly in relation to vaccines, its use in rendering safe plasma products. The effects of heat treatment in rendering safe, otherwise potentially harmful substances is well established and dates back to the work with bacteria in the mid-19th century. The discovery is that, first, there existed viruses as well as bacteria, and subsequently that these viruses could also be vulnerable to heat, predate the events giving rise to this inquiry by decades. We have set out in our written closing submission how this knowledge progressed and how, through the Second World War, albumin was remembered safe through pasteurization. Given that efforts, and again I would probably say this name very badly, given that efforts by Behringwerk in Germany to virally inactivate concentrates had borne fruit by 1978, BPL, Blood Products Laboratory, were dilatory in their approach to developing virally inactivated concentrates. Once a concerted effort was made, from a standing start, it took no longer than 2 years for fractionators to produce effectively heat-treated concentrates. If untreated blood products had been prevented from use, the very market forces which drove their dissemination into this country and into the veins of this community would have meant that the companies supplying this material would have turned their minds and their money to the inactivation of viruses within their products. By the early 70s and the advent of black factor concentrates, we find an odd paradox, where it is well known amongst those in blood collection and transfusion medicine that the pooling of blood plasma without any viral inactivation technique will increase the risk of virus transmission to the recipient. Yet at the same time, we have those with an interest in haemophilia care, whether they be doctors or pharmaceutical companies, racing to produce blood products which were to present a significantly greater risk of transmitting viruses. One might expect that, fixed with the knowledge that increasing plasma pool sizes increases risk, those developing and marketing the products might have taken some time and effort and expense to attempt to virally inactivate the filth that they were producing to haemophiliacs as a wonder drug. Now, there's some evidence, Dr. Foster, I refer to now, there's some evidence, Dr. Foster said that this wasn't so. He said that factor VIII protein was considered so heat labile that the concept of subjecting it to pasteurization was inconceivable to him. Well, there are problems with that assertion. The first is that heat treatment and other viral inactivation techniques were clearly not considered unthinkable by all fractionators. The chronology of events dictates that at the time Dr. Foster and some other witnesses to the inquiry were still averring that the idea was unthinkable, Boehringer scientists had clearly had the idea a number of years before and had some success in developing pasteurization techniques. The second problem is that Boehringer were not alone in taking steps to virally inactivate products. They weren't mavericks at the vanguard of product safety. They just got further than some of their American rivals. There is an extract of the book Blood on Their Hands by Eric Weinberg and Donna Shaw available on Relativity. We will supply the Relativity reference at a later stage. The book recounts the story of Mr. Weinberg's investigation and subsequent conduct of the litigation in America taken by haemophiliacs infected with HIV against the pharmaceutical companies, of which, as Sarah, you're aware, our client group took part. Chapter 9 of that book, from page 94 onwards, described Dr. Weinberg's first contact and meeting with Dr. Edward Shanbrom, the chief medical advisor at Highland, with responsibility for the first development of concentrates in the United States. Dr. Shanbrom is said to have raised concerns about the viral safety of concentrates in 1970, after noticing patients who were HBV antibody positive were nevertheless falling ill with a new kind of hepatitis. Dr. Shanbrom is said to have been slowly let go by Highland as a result of the expression of those concerns. Now, Dr. Shanbrom would, of course, ultimately go on to develop a detergent washing system for virally inactivating concentrates, which was licensed by the New York Red Cross. Elsewhere, the inquiry has seen evidence that Travenol was investigating viral inactivation techniques in the 70s, including heat treatment, but that its research priority was slowly downgraded during the course of 78 from a grade A priority to grade B priority. It is expressly stated within Travenol memos that the research cannot proceed any further without more funding and dedicated research time. References to that are CGRA 40213 onwards 214, 5, 6, and 7. Why wasn't time and resource given to this research? That's because the pharmaceutical companies didn't need to. They were able to peddle their contaminated product with the knowledge, consent, and approval of US and UK regulators. Travenol did, in 79, urgently upgrade their research into pasteurization, but not through motives of trying to protect patients. That was for the commercial reasons, and for no other reason than to protect their market position in light of Boehringer development of a heat-treated product. Reference to that is CGRA 40218. Let's tie these threads together. There is no scientific or technological discovery which takes place between 1970 and 84, which suddenly enables effective viral inactivation. It is old science and old technology which is utilized ultimately to successfully virally inactivate products. Heating a product in a stabilizing solution, the same technique applied to albumin for decades. Intellectual curiosity may have been lacking, but the only thing really missing to unlocking a safer treatment was an incentive. It is important that had the UK licensing authority done its job properly and refused to grant licenses to these lethal products, a clear and loud message would have been broadcast not just to the pharmaceuticals, but to other regulators across Europe and North America. That message would have been that the risk-reward balance did not tilt in favour of reward, and that these products were unacceptably dangerous. That in turn would have provided the incentive that pharmaceutical companies would have needed to address viral threat and properly and sooner. After all, when they were forced to put their minds to the task in light of AIDS, they managed to largely succeed in the space of little more than 18 months. I now turn to AIDS. This is a very short section. The damage had already been done by 1982. The domino effect of the failure to protect people from the dangers of infection with hepatitis meant that haemophiliacs were inevitably going to be infected with whatever viruses were swimming in the vast pools of blood from paid donors in the United States. Essentially, our submission in relation to the transmission of AIDS into the haemophilic community is that this is a domino effect. And what had happened is that the earlier failure to protect people from the use of blood products and the obvious dangers from the viruses contained within those products meant that so many people were already infected by the time message came through in the early 80s. Dr. Franklin, at paragraphs 36 and 37 of his statement, WITN 403-2001, says, by 1982, there had been a few cases of transfusion-associated AIDS in the USA, and also a few men with haemophilia had the condition. Going on to say, regarding awareness of association between AIDS and the use of blood products, for transfusion-associated AIDS late in 82 in the USA, for plasma products in patients in the UK during 83, I found out about that connection from his point of view via medical journals, news items, and word of mouth. And so you have our submissions, which set out in detail the chronology of events leading to the awareness of knowledge of the risk of AIDS within blood products at that time. Clearly, insufficient was done to withdraw those products. The answer should have been, get them off the shelves. Don't use them. Dispose of them. I now turn to campaigners. Lawrence, if you would please, we're going to be looking at some images, photographs of haemophiliac protesters, and they start. We look to the right-hand side. First of all, this is for date purposes, this is in relation to March to Downing Street on the 3rd of April 2001. And if we look then at the photograph that appeared on the left, and if you can turn the one to the left right way up. Thank you. That's Miss Wintle and her husband, Stephen. And so you can see all around them the signs, what is being said, Hep C, death sentence, RIP, help the sick, suffering and bereaved. Next page, please. Again, left-hand side, photograph of Cadet Wimple. She's holding in her hands the bags of, these weren't real, but this is bags of blood symbols being used to demonstrate the nature of what had happened in the past. And if we move on to the next page, please. We see here, that again, Miss Wintle and Miss Grayson, and at the top page and the bottom, at the Downing Street part of the march. Thank you, Raj. The incredible campaigning work of Carol Grayson and her husband, Pete Longstaff, a severe haemophiliac who died of his infections, should be recognised by us all. Carol and Pete did everything humanly possible to bring this dark passage of history into the light. Miss Wintle joined with Carol, and together their campaigning became their jobs, unfunded. The basics of life and healthcare became subjugated to the campaign. I recall standing with Miss Wintle in the area outside of the tea room, in now, I believe, and told by Mr. Harrison, the torn-down building that we used to inhabit for this inquiry. I was with her standing outside the tea room there, and we spoke about her years of campaigning. And this is not just a reference to her, but all of the other campaigners. The years of campaigning, the lack of ability to pursue a career, how it took over everything, family life, finances. This will have happened to the many campaigners. The life of campaigners, sir, is very different to the commercial lobbyist, paid for by corporate interests who don't have to fund their own travel, paper, printing, and telephone costs. Their and others' relentless campaigning kept the very issues we have examined for 4 years in the public eye and in discussion. Carol Collette's work has been foundational. Other campaigners and this inquiry have followed in the path they worked so hard to forge. They were not the only campaigners, but as we have heard from the evidence from politicians, they were prolific and constant. In the history of this scandal, Carol Grayson's name, Colette Wintle's name, should be remembered, acknowledged, and honoured. Following the death of her husband, Miss Grayson started her research, leading to a seminal dissertation available on the Haemophilia Society's website, titled MA in Gender, Culture and Development, Blood Flows Not Just Through Our Veins, but Through Our Minds. I read any part, chapter 6, the conclusion. I believe that my analysis of the SSR, the Self-Sufficiency Report, reveals that much more could have been done by the government and medical practitioners to protect haemophiliacs from the risk of contamination with HIV and hepatitis viruses at every stage. Once they became aware that haemophiliacs were infected, they disempowered patients by withholding information, denying them informed choice in relation to treatment, carrying out unethical research, and in some cases failing to treat their medical conditions. We suggest we should all pay attention to what Ms. Grayson was writing there, because she foreshadowed so many of the aspects that we have been considering in the evidence over these many years of this inquiry. The campaigning work by so many didn't just have to address government, but also had to look at times to the work of the representative body of the Haemophilia Society. Now, the Haemophilia Society, we say without question, has become more representative and is trying to work with the community. But that has not always been seamless. Letter from Chris Hodgson that was examined within the inquiry time, WITN 1055079, referring to the campaign now being more inclusive, suggesting that it hadn't been so inclusive in the past. Women campaigners and women infected with hepatitis and/or HIV have always faced stigma and discrimination and have had to fight tooth and nail for the inclusion within campaigns and consideration by government. Claire Walton and WITN, anonymous witness WITN 1388, were forced through this lack of recognition to start their own campaign for those women who are infected with HIV by their partners who had, of course, been infected by blood products themselves. Non-haemophiliac women with HIV were not catered for by the haemophiliac centres and instead were treated at HIV clinics, where the ready assumption was always made that they had been infected through drug use or had been sex workers. At times, the evidence has demonstrated that women have been relegated to the back row and excluded from the heart of discussion. You'll recall Ms. Pappenheim at paragraph 11 of her statement, WITN 4504001, referring to the launch of the Women's Project. She refers to it as being very important. Charity was recognising and seeking to engage with the women affected by the scandal. But you see, this is what happens, isn't it? If government pushes away or refuses to consider its own culpability, then in turn it avoids its own responsibility to sort out its mess, instead leaving the debris of victims and the avoidance of support for those infected both directly and indirectly. During the course of the inquiry, I sent a message by Claire Walton, who I represent. I read it. As an infected widow, I'd been out on a limb and ignored in the community. Most of my adult life, since 23, has been consumed with dealing with the aftermath of my husband's HIV diagnosis, caring for my dying husband, making sense of my own HIV infection, loss of family life, discrimination, stigma, near death from AIDS-defining illness, relentless 30-year battle with the MFT over the charge of my home, restricting my freedom to move away and get on with my life. Attempting to maintain a career I loved, pursue a semblance of normal life, the campaign for justice and the recognition and understanding of the needs or the needs of women living with HIV. And then she finished that by saying, then we get the THT. Now, the effects of the decades of delayed acknowledgement of harm done by the state is that instead of considering and dealing with the fallout from the NHS's, the Ministry of Health's failures to protect its vulnerable patients, what we have instead is a failure to consider how far that harm has extended. Decades of delays, not just in compensation, but in rounded support for its victims or families. Haemophiliacs who have been infected all face complicating features of their conditions, and the combination of medications also give rise to adverse effects through treatment interaction. And you'll recall the evidence from the witness before the Archer inquiry, reference ARCH 604_0010. The description, which I recall, stuck in my mind, was being a bit like being on chemotherapy for the rest of your life. Long-term, an individual infected with HCV and those co-infected with Hep B and HIV may go on to develop various chronic infections. Some of the possible complications are costochondritis, fibromyalgia, early onset of menopause, deterioration of the spinal discs, connected to the antiviral chemotherapy used to treat chronic HIV. And we're also behind, as I recall in speaking to an anonymous client I represent, we're also very much behind in our research as to the long-term effect upon an aging population of haemophiliacs with infections and co-infections. The damage to the liver in an infected individual is well known, as is the increased possibility of developing cancer. But the liver damage can also affect blood platelets, which if they reach low level can be life-threatening. The consequences and possible complications which arise from infection via contaminated blood and the need for support for partners of haemophiliacs and deceased haemophiliacs can be identified, and the needs of the limited community of people are known. The partners of deceased haemophiliacs are inadequately catered for within the NHS. As they get older, they face continuing and often worsening issues with stress, depression, and PTSD. I spoke with Ms. Amanda Beasley the other day. She spoke about the fact of the way that it feels to her sometimes that she's teetering on the brink. She spoke about her well-rehearsed knitting of threads together, which might unravel as being her mental state. The failure by government to listen to the truth and acknowledge its own responsibility for these decades has multiplied the suffering. That needs to be stated, it needs to be recognised, and it needs to be acknowledged by the state. So I now go on to deal with recommendations. So this chapter, the final chapter in my submissions, is recommendations and the way forward. So you will have read and seen our submissions on recommendations. They're at page 196 onwards. we see no benefit in repeating those submissions orally. Instead, I'm going to make some submissions about the Terence Higgins Trust, the THT, governmental change, and then go on to suggest a proposal for you to consider as to the delivery of your report. Terence Higgins Trust. Without wishing to take away from the important and life-changing work that the Terence Higgins Trust has done over the last 40 years, their involvement with the former Macfarlane Trust registrants is simply inappropriate. We deal with this in some detail in our recommendation submissions. And I don't want to overly labour this point, but I do want to say that the former MFT Macfarlane Trust registrants' objections to TST are not based on any foundation of prejudice or any sense of guilty and innocent victims of HIV. Their objections are based solely on the fact that the interests pursued by the THT do not coincide with those of the former registrants and in fact conflict with them. That point has been illustrated recently with the THT throwing itself behind a campaign to make every contact count, essentially advocating an opt-out scheme whereby every time blood is taken in a clinical setting, it ought to be tested for HIV, HCV and HPV. Well, recalling the vast amount of evidence you have heard of the last 4 years, sir, the idea that people ought to have their blood tested for these viruses without a proper pre-test counselling framework in place is the antithesis of what the former MFT registrant would want to see in its place. At its most fundamental, the residual Macfarlane Trust funds represent power which is capable of being wielded over the former registrants. The former registrants of the MFT Trust, those we represent, want to see those funds surrendered by the THT, divided amongst the 4 national haemophilia societies and employed for the purposes of creating monuments to the former registrants. This is the only way that the power residing in the residual funds can be eradicated, and the only way in which the former registrants will be freed from the advocacy which has been forced unwantedly upon them. Now turn to government. Regarding government, we must stop the head-banging. The head-banging I refer to is the head-banging of campaigners and survivors against the administrative and overly bureaucratic castle walls of state. In what has almost become an oft-used hackneyed phrase, speaking truth to power, that only works if power is prepared to listen. Instead, what we have seen and discussed in this inquiry and other inquiries is that power only listens randomly, capriciously, and frankly when it's politically in the mood and has a moment. It is hard to accept, sir, that government lobbyists paid for by corporate funds who employ basically insider club members, many of them ex-politicians, ministers and even prime ministers, who automatically, it seems, have access when campaign groups have to increasingly get permission from the police to demonstrate outside the hallowed walls. It is not difficult to say that something clearly is going wrong. Disasters have happened in the past, and disasters are going to happen again. Disasters of themselves are not unusual. So why do we find that there is no system to cope? Why do we find there's no system to cope with the victims? Campaigners should not be met with a blank wall of state and the words, the government line. The government line phrase, or anything similar, should be treated by current and future ministers with scepticism and questioning, and not blind acceptance. A simple improvement, we suggest, would be for all government lines to be dated so that we know when they started, and for ministers to ask, if that is not apparent, for how long has this line been held? In addition to consideration of ours and others' proposed recommendations, you may wish in your report, sir, to comment on the need for an inquiry recommendation oversight system. We've considered how that might be done. This could be by a dedicated select committee, or the use of the standing departmental committees for the relevant ministry, with a duty to maintain a watch on inquiry and perhaps inquest recommendations. Select committees have the power to call for evidence and witnesses to come forward and publicly seek explanations for delays in implementation or reasons why individual recommendations are no longer required. Now, this is never going to be a perfect system. For example, we note that select committees have no power to call for evidence from members of Parliament or ministers, although generally they do secure the cooperation of government ministers. So I turn now to the delivery of your report. I do so gently and with trepidation, because I respectfully am going to make submissions as to the shape of your report. Can I suggest, sir, that in everything you do and consider when looking at the evidence in this matter and looking and then thinking about your recommendations, that you aim, as far as it is humanly possible, at peace and finality? After Penrose, Lindsay, Archer, let's make this the final report on the worst medical disaster in the history of the NHS. So what do I mean by peace? I think what I mean is that we must finish the job, or put it another way, leave no loose ends. Now, I remember so you may accept, many years ago, working as a paralegal, employed by a terrific East End solicitor, Miss Terry Macmillan, recently retired as a judge on the island of Guernsey. She always said to me, finish the job, and I always took that to be wise words. Later on in my career, in moments of reflection, I have in odd moments wondered whether she just meant to me directly, you finish the job. Nevertheless, it stuck in my mind as a phrase and a touchstone for the work that I've done over many a year. Peace, in the way I've described it, is very difficult to do within the powers of a statutory inquiry. As when you finish the last full stop on the last page of your report and the report is delivered to government, your powers as an inquiry judge, as an inquiry chair, are extinguished. This has every potential to leave your report and its findings and recommendations at the whim of government. And I think that we can establish one thing: government is not trusted from our client group or indeed this community. So what we ask is this: you consider issuing a final report, setting out your findings on the main evidential points and the conclusions that follow, but deliver part of your report as an interim report, allowing for time for government to complete its internal discussions on the compensation scheme framework, incidentally allowing time for an answer from the Department of Health to your question about what it has apologised for. The advantage of taking such a course, splitting essentially the report into a main report with its conclusions, findings, and its main recommendations. The answer that would be provided would be the retention of your powers under the Act, so that you could then, if required and if necessary, call for evidence from whoever at that time might be the minister in charge, or to recall Sir Robert to answer questions as to the viability and acceptability of the government response and proposals as regards compensation. After all, sir, as we have seen very recently, not following report recommendations is hardly a new sport. We note the recent news and discussions about the Hillsborough report, and the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has recently reneged on the government's commitments given in the light of the Windrush report recommendations. So we make these submissions, and we find support for this way ahead in the terms of reference, always useful. Treatment, care and support, number 8 of the terms of reference. This inquiry is bound to consider the nature and adequacy of the treatment, care and support, including financial assistance provided to people who are infected and affected, including the bereaved. And so to achieve finality and to achieve what I've discussed by way of the way forward, you may find that that paragraph would assist you in considering that the split way of providing a report would give government the understanding of your findings, the consideration of evidence, while also leaving open the ability to be able to consider the way that government responds. In our submission, this inquiry will not have fulfilled its terms of reference, with the greatest respect, until such time as it has been established what the government will do in terms of financial provision for the infected and affected going forwards. The Department of Health's evasive closing submissions lend, we suggest, special weight to the necessity to continue to apply scrutiny to the action of government in this regard. Before I set out my final and very short concluding remarks, let me use this platform to send a message to the Labour Party. Wes Streeting MP is Labour's Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary, and with Sir Keir Starmer, we suggest he and they must, as a matter of urgency, commit the next possible government to the implementation of the inquiry recommendations and the establishment of the compensation scheme. We are, sir, all aware that the politics of the moment are even more unstable than usual, and that is saying something. But the victims and survivors of this disaster must not be left to wonder whether a possible future Labour government might hold up or stall the development of the compensation scheme. My final concluding remarks. So I have to accept that my request for peace is the hardest of goals. But many of those infected and affected simply want peace and the ability, as far as this can ever be achieved, to put this behind them and quietly get on with the remainder of their lives. We ask, sir, that you bear this goal in mind when finalising your report. But, sir, at least for now, you get peace from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stein. You need not have worried, as you said at the start, whether you would do your duty by your clients. Plainly you have. I will have something to say, perhaps this afternoon, which may touch upon the last matters that you were mentioning.
Thanks.
But you'll have to wait and hear that if you want to. Before me, we'll have Miss Richards, but we won't have her now. We'll have her at 10 to 2. 10 to 2.